Quarantine shadows. The cold wind howled through the narrow alleyways of Boston as the first reports of an unknown virus surfaced. Panic spread faster than the infection itself, and soon the city found itself plunged into chaos. In a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, Peter Mitchell huddled in fear, watching the world outside disintegrate through his grimy window. The news had been dire, but Peter never thought it would come to this. As the infected roamed the streets, the city plunged into madness. Sirens wailed, and distant screams echoed through the air. The once lively neighborhood now resembled a ghost town. Peter, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a thin frame, had become a prisoner in his own home. Fear gripped him, paralyzing any rational thought. The moans of the undead lingered like a sinister symphony outside his apartment door. The initial days of the outbreak had seen Peter glued to the television, absorbing every bit of information. But as the situation worsened, he barricaded himself inside, the heavy furniture forming a makeshift fortress against the impending doom, the fear of the unknown rendering him motionless, trapped within the confines of his paranoia. The water supply dwindled, and canned goods disappeared one by one. Peter rationed his food, unwilling to venture outside even for necessities. His once comfortable home transformed into a prison of isolation, haunted by the shadows of uncertainty. Late one night, as Peter strained to hear any signs of the undead outside, a faint knock echoed through the building. His heart pounded in his chest as he listened intently. Another knock followed, this time more persistent. Peter clenched his fists, sweat forming on his brow. Should he answer? What is it, a survivor seeking refuge, or a trap set by the infected? Days passed, and the knocking persisted. The isolation gnawed at his Peter's sanity. The loneliness and fear began to blur reality, and his once clear mind succumbed to the delirium of isolation. Sleep deprivation and paranoia created hallucinations of shadows lurking in the corners of his apartment, whispering dark secrets that fueled his terror. As the city outside descended further into chaos, Peter's mental state deteriorated. One day, driven by a desperate need for supplies, he mustered the courage to venture into the eerily silent streets. The cityscape was unrecognizable, buildings tainted by the aftermath of the outbreak. Peter moved cautiously, haunted by the memories of the once familiar streets now overrun by the undead. Boston, once a vibrant city, now stood as a graveyard of the living. Peter stumbled through the desolation, his eyes hollow and haunted. He scavenged for supplies, his every step echoing with the realization that the world as he knew it had crumbled. In the end, it wasn't the zombies that proved to be Peter's greatest enemy. It was a fear that kept him prisoner in his own mind. The infected roamed the streets, but Peter had been a captive long before the outbreak, shackled by the invisible chains of his own terror. Desperate hours. Detective Michael Reynolds sprinted through the chaotic streets of New York, his heart pounding in his chest. The first day of the outbreak had unleashed a nightmarish torrent of undead upon the city. Michael's only thought was to get home to his wife, Emily, and their 2 young children. As a veteran police officer, Michael had faced danger before, but nothing prepared him for the horrors that now roamed the once bustling streets. The initial calls came in as isolated incidents, but within hours, the city plunged into anarchy. Reports of cannibalistic attack flooded the police radio, and Michael knew he had to reach his family before it was too late. Abandoning his patrol car, Michael maneuvered through abandoned vehicles and panicked crowds. The city that never slept now lay paralyzed by fear. Smoke billowed in the distance, and the distant scream mingled with the sporadic gunfire that echoed through the concrete canyons. Michael's police radio crackled with updates from his colleagues, each report more dire than the last. The outbreak had spread like wildfire, overwhelming law enforcement and emergency services. The world outside had succumbed to chaos, but Michael clung to the hope of reuniting with his family. His mind raced as he navigated the once familiar streets, now transformed into a battlefield. He fought his way through pockets of the undead, using his police training to stay one step ahead. The stench of death hung in the air as he moved through desolate neighborhoods haunted by memories of the city he once served. As Michael neared his apartment building, his anxiety intensified. The journey would have taken him minutes, now felt like an eternity. He burst through the entrance, his police badge glinting in the dim light of the lobby. Stairwell after stairwell he climbed, each step echoing the desperation of a father racing against time. Upon reaching his floor, Michael hesitated outside his apartment door. The ominous silence sent shivers down his spine. Slowly turning the key, he stepped into the dimly lit living room. His eyes scanned the place, searching for any sign of his family. A muffled sound caught his attention. Michael's heart leapt as he followed the noise to the bedroom. There he found Emily huddled with their children, fear etched on their faces. Relief flooded him, but it was short-lived. The windows rattled as the undead pounded on the building. Michael knew they had little time. With a determined resolve, he ushered his family out of the apartment. The once familiar streets now served as a perilous path of safety. In the heart of the outbreak, Michael Reynolds, a devoted father and police officer, faced the ultimate test of survival. Together with his family, they navigated the treacherous streets of New York, determined to find refuge in a world that had crumbled into chaos on the first day of the apocalypse. Eternal Shadows. In the desolate world that had succumbed to the clutches of the undead, two brothers, Alex and Jake, found solace in the unlikeliest of professions: delivery men for the remaining human settlements. With their trusty old truck, they traversed the abandoned highways, delivering supplies and hope to the dwindling pockets of humanity. The brothers had learned to navigate the new world with a careful blend of survival instincts and cunning. They moved quietly, avoiding the undead hordes that roamed the streets. The once vibrant cities now stood as silent, crumbling reminders of the civilization that once thrived. One day, as the brothers approached a settlement on the outskirts, they noticed an eerie silence had hung heavy in the air. The settlement seemed deserted, its gates wide open. Unease gnawed at their guts as they cautiously entered, weapons at the ready. They soon discovered the settlement had fallen prey to a group of cannibals, led by a charismatic yet deranged individual named Marcus. Unlike the typical undead, Marcus and his followers believed that by consuming the flesh of the undead, they could become impervious to the virus, a twisted form of immortality. The brothers, having stumbled upon this gruesome scene, realized the immediate threat posed by Marcus and his cannibalistic horde. They decided to retreat silently, avoiding confrontation and formulating a plan to warn neighboring settlements about the impending danger. As they traveled, delivering supplies and spreading the word, the brothers encountered more settlements that had fallen victim to Marcus's insidious group. The undead were becoming less of a concern as the cannibals grew in number and ruthlessness. Determined to put an end to the cannibals' reign of terror, Alex and Jack began gathering allies from the remaining settlements. They formed a resistance force, armed with the knowledge of the cannibals' tactics and their hunger for the undead. The final showdown took place in an abandoned industrial complex, where Marcus had set up his twisted headquarters. The air was thick with tension as the resistance clashed with the cannibalistic horde. Amidst the chaos, Alex and Jake confronted Marcus, their brotherhood tested by the horrors they faced. In a fierce battle, the brothers managed to defeat Marcus, shattering the illusion of immortality that had driven his followers to madness. With Marcus gone, the remaining cannibals either dispersed or joined the surviving settlements, realizing the futility of their dark quest. As the brothers stood amongst the ruins of the industrial complex, they reflected on their sacrifices made and the losses endured. The undead may have brought chaos, but it was the darkness within humanity that had posed an even greater threat. In this new world, where survival meant more than just avoiding the undead, Alex and Jake continued their journey, committed to bringing hope to those clung to life amid the eternal shadows. The Hollow's Descent, a symphony of shadows. The moon hung low in the inky sky, casting an eerie glow over the desolate town of Raven's Hollow. A thick fog crept through the deserted streets, shrouding the once lively community in an ominous silence. The air was heavy with the stench of decay, and the only sound that echoed was the distant moaning of the undead. It had started innocently enough. A mysterious virus had spread like wildfire, turning the unsuspecting residents into flesh-hungry monsters. The military had tried to contain the outbreak, but their efforts proved futile. Now, Raven's Hollow stood as a graveyard of the living, with only the restless dead roaming its forgotten streets. Amelia, A young woman with wild eyes and a heart pounding with fear tiptoed through the abandoned buildings, her flashlight flickering as she navigated the darkness. She had lost everyone she loved to the relentless horde, and now survival was her only instinct. The crunching of gravel under her boots echoed in the eerie stillness. Suddenly, a low growl pierced the silence, freezing Amelia in her tracks. She aimed her flashlight toward the source of the sound, and gasped at the sight of a grotesque figure limping towards her. Its milky eyes glowed with hunger that sent shivers down her spine. The creature's rotted flesh hung from its bones, and its tattered clothing hinted at a past life now consumed by an insatiable desire for human flesh. Amelia's heart raced as she stumbled backwards, her breath hitching with every step. The creature closed in, and more emerged from the shadows, their haunting moans echoing from the fog. Panic set in, and she turned to run, her flashlight casting erratic beams of light as she desperately sought an escape. The once familiar streets now seemed like a labyrinth of death, each corner hiding a new horror. As she sprinted through the maze of twisted alleys, the relentless pursuit of the undead never waned. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the fog seemed to swallow her whole. Amelia's chest burned with exhaustion as she stumbled into an old, dilapidated church. The creaking door groaned as she forced it closed, hoping to buy a moment of respite. The darkness inside was oppressive, and the silence felt like a weight on her shoulders. Just as she caught her breath, a low, guttural growl emanated from the shadows. The pale, lifeless eyes of the undead emerged from the corners of the room. Panic seized her at once, and she fumbled for anything to defend herself. In the dim light, she spotted a rusted shovel leaning against the altar. As the first zombie lunged at her, Amelia swung the shovel with all her strength, the metal connecting with a sickening thud. The others closed in, their grotesque forms illuminated by the feeble glow of her flashlight. The once sacred space now echoed with the desperate sounds of survival. Amelia fought with everything she had, the echoes of her struggle bouncing off the church's walls. The undead seemed endless, a relentless tide that threatened to engulf her. In the midst of the chaos, she couldn't help but wonder if Raven's Hollow was doomed to be a graveyard for the living, or if, against all odds, she could cling to life and defy the nightmarish fate that had befallen her world.